Hello and welcome back to Session 2, the Church. We'll start with a review of some of the things we talked about in the first session. Wake up to the revelation. Remember, this is all about the revealing, the unveiling, or the breaking through of God's kingdom into the earth, taking it away from Satan and setting up his own kingdom. Remember that the word revelation in Greek is the word apocalypse, which refers to a battle amongst the gods. And apocalyptic literature is symbolic. And so we talked a lot about symbolism last time. Also, I mentioned the different views or interpretations of Revelation. This is a picture of the chapters organized with the pre-tribulation view in mind, where we are in the church age right now. And once the church is raptured up to heaven, then the tribulation begins in chapter 4. The post-tribulation view of that is that we are in the church age now, and we go through the tribulation, through the seal judgments, the trumpet judgments, but before the seventh trumpet is sounded, introducing the bowls of wrath, the church will no longer be here because God didn't appoint us to his wrath. We will be gone then. And so the purpose of this entire study, once again, is to encourage believers and to alert us to some of the things that are going on so that we will be ready and won't be surprised, that we will be on guard. And so let's start with chapter 2 in Revelation. And that would be page 3 in your, page 12 in your workbook. Here we have, again, the four views of the church, of these different churches, and four ways to look at these as we go through these chapters. That they were actual churches in the year 95, that they're representative of churches today, that they also speak of 7 historical periods over the last 2,000 years, and then that they deal with principles as well of good and evil. Here we have a picture of where these 7 churches are located, a map of Western Asia, or today Western Turkey. And here you'll see the arrow pointing to the island of Patmos, where John was exiled to. And we'll start with the church at Ephesus. Ephesus represents the beginning of the church age. And Jesus makes 2 interesting points as he talks about each of these churches. First, to each church, the letter has a unique reference to Jesus himself from his description back in chapter 1. He weaves himself into the midst of each church. And so, for example, in chapter 2, verse 1, we read that he holds the 7 stars. And when he holds them, the actual word that's used means to grasp, so that they can't be taken out of his hand. It reminds me of the words to a worship song that say, "Nothing can tear us from the grip of his mighty love." Also, in chapter 2, it goes on to talk about him walking amongst the 7 lampstands. And that's a reference again back to chapter 1, verse 13, where it talks about him being in the midst of the lampstands. We might not always be faithful to him, but he will always be in our midst. He'll never abandon us. And so, continuing on here with Ephesus, we can see that the letter to this church not only has a reference back to Jesus, but also a unique reference to the city of, in this case, Ephesus. Ephesus was the most important seacoast on the west coast of Asia, and the city actually moved 3 different times due to silt deposits from the Cayster River that ran through it. In chapter 2, verse 5, Jesus says, "I will come to you and remove your lampstand from its place." If you don't repent, your lampstand, your light, your witness as a church will be moved, just like the city itself was moved from time to time when necessary. But why repent? What had they done wrong? Well, we read in verse 4 that Ephesus abandoned their first love. Ephesus was the principal city of Asia Minor and the center of the Christian movement at that time. It was also a major financial center and the center of worship for Artemis, the fertility goddess. Her temple was one of the 7 wonders of the world, twice the size of a football field. In Acts 19, Paul said that Artemis was not a god, and that led to a riot. In verse 29, we're told, of Acts 19, the city was filled with confusion, and they all rushed into the amphitheater. And so here's a picture of the amphitheater in Ephesus today. Paul warned them of false teachers, and they took this to heart. In chapter 2, verse 2, we're told, "You have tested those who call themselves apostles and are not. You have found them to be liars." They tested people diligently, but did their test to see if the faith of others was genuine. Did that lead them to act in an unloving, suspicious way toward those with whom they disagreed? Did they, and do we, respond unlovingly to those that we disagree with? Maybe a neighbor or a relative, elected officials, the liberal media, or movie stars. George Tiller made the headlines in 1991. He was a doctor in Wichita, Kansas. And I was living in Kansas then. I'm from Kansas. And in that particular summer of 1991, some of you might remember that there were abortion protests going on. George Tiller was one of 3 doctors to do late-term abortions in the United States. And so they were protesting throughout the summer. And it was on the news every night. Well, about 18 years later, he was serving as an usher in his church when someone came in and assassinated him. We're to love our enemies. If we lose our love for others, does that also cause us to drift away from Jesus, our first love? We live in a pluralistic society. People have various beliefs, and with many no longer believe the Bible to be the source of truth. And so I have a question that I ask myself as I look at each of these churches. And the one I ask myself regarding Ephesus is this: do I fight for the truth, but in the process lose my love for others? In verse 5, we see what they were to do. They were to remember, to repent, redo, or do the works that they did at first. The temple of Artemis began as a tree shrine. Any criminal, by touching the tree in the middle of the temple, would be forgiven. And so before being exiled to Patmos, John was the pastor of the church in Ephesus. And turn to verse 7. And we see that he may be thinking of this church as he hears Jesus' promise to the victors, to the overcomers of the church in Ephesus. You will have the right to eat from the tree of life. Let's go on to the next church, Smyrna. And as you might be able to see, John is here on the island of Patmos. The first letter goes to Ephesus, the next one goes to Smyrna, and they continue on in a clockwise fashion. So it would have been easier for a messenger to deliver the scroll and the message to the recipients in the churches. And so Smyrna, that word comes from the word myrrh and is a reference to death. Ephesus represents the beginning of the church age, but Smyrna represents the next 300 years in the life of the church when it was under pressure and persecution. But Smyrna exhibited faith under pressure. Smyrna was second in size and importance to Ephesus, but they bragged about their being first they were first among the cities of Asia. So Jesus tells them, no, I am the first as well as the last, a reference back to chapter 1, verse 17. The city of Smyrna was destroyed 600 BC, but then rebuilt 300 years later. And they were proud of their resurrection. And so Jesus said, no, I'm the one who was dead and came back to life. In chapter 1, verse 18. Verse 9, he says, I know your tribulation, the afflictions, the suffering that you're going through. Nero was an emperor back in the 60s, from 60 to 68 or so AD. And there were a lot of persecutions in Rome at that time. But now, 30 years later, the emperor is Domitian. And he is far harsher in his persecutions. The persecutions are spreading throughout the empire to places like Smyrna. Polycarp was an early church father who was martyred in Smyrna. Emperor Domitian declared himself to be a god and demanded worship. Here we have a coin of Domitian. And you can see him here, a profile of him. And then here you can also see his name written here. It's upside down, but there's the name Domitian. And here's the flip side of that coin. And Domitian is sitting on a globe, sitting on the earth. And you see his hands are stuck out there. And guess what rings this picture right here? There are 7 stars that he seems to be holding. And so Domitian was a big persecutor of the church. Continuing on in chapter 2, verse 9, Jesus says, I know your poverty. Smyrna, as well as Philadelphia, were the smallest of the 2 churches in size and influence, yet Jesus said to the 2 of those churches that you are rich, because neither of them was condemned. Jesus also knew that they were being slandered. In verse, going back again to chapter 2, verse 9, the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not. They were being slandered. The Romans believed in multiple gods. And so Emperor Domitian accepted Judaism as just another belief system, just one of many religions. Thus, the Jews in Smyrna were on good terms with the Romans. But Christianity was a problem. It was thought by many to be just a sect of Judaism. And it was a problem because Christians put their allegiance to Christ ahead of Emperor Domitian. And so the Jews, not wanting to be mistaken as Christians, would inform on them, leading to their poverty, their loss of property, and their loss of life. The Jews thus became, as we see here in this 9th verse, a synagogue of Satan. Note that this is the shortest of the letters, and the body of this letter is in verses 9 and 10. It begins and ends with the words tribulation. I know your tribulation and your poverty is how verse 9 starts. And drop down to the last part of verse 10. You will have tribulation. And so this entire letter, the body of it, even though it's only 2 verses, begins and ends with tribulation. And that word for tribulation is a word which refers to crushing pressure, not just everyday frustrations, breaking a nail or losing your car keys, but to crushing pressure, the result of an apocalyptic clash of kingdoms, of Satan's kingdom and of God's kingdom. In verse 10, we are told that the devil will test believers for 10 days. Now, should we take this number literally? We might, if we think back to Daniel chapter 1, verse 12, where Daniel and his friends are tested for 10 days. But again, numbers in Revelation are highly symbolic. 10 usually stands for completion, completeness. 10 fingers, 10 toes, the 10 commandments. And so 10 could stand for a complete, thorough test. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me to imagine that they are only talking about 10 days. it seems like it's talking more about a thorough test. In the last part of verse 10, it talks about perseverance, to endure, to be faithful unto death, and that will result in the crown of life. Smyrna didn't have to worry about the second death because of their faithfulness. If you are born only once, physically, you'll die twice, physically and spiritually. But if you're born twice, if you're born physically and born again spiritually, you'll only die once. We can see in the last part of verse 11 that the victor will never be harmed by that second death. Did tribulation pressure help form this church into one that was only commended and not condemned? Can persecutions be a good thing? We can worship freely here, at least for now. But we in the U.S. are only about 5% of the world's population. The question I think of when I think of this church of Smyrna, am I ready for persecutions to begin here? Ephesus represents the church's beginning, and Smyrna the next 300 years of the persecuted church. But next church is Pergamum. In A.D. 313, the Roman Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity, so persecutions began to subside. But compromise increased. And so, Pergamum, the next church, is a picture of a church that became married to the world. Pergamum was one of the few Roman cities that was allowed to inflict capital punishment. We can see in verse 12 and in verse 16 a reference to the sword. The sword was their symbol. And of course we can think back to chapter 1 where it talks about the sword in Jesus' description. Pergamum, that word, was derived from the word parchment. And Pergamum was famous for its library with 200,000 parchment scrolls. The city loved words and new ideas. In verse 13, we read about Satan's throne. Pergamum had numerous temples and altars, and on a hill that rose 800 feet above the city, there was a huge altar to Zeus, who was the supreme ruler of the gods. Animals were sacrificed on this altar, on Satan's throne, 24 hours a day. The smoke and the smell was always in the air, yet they remained true. They held on to, they grasped his name and remained faithful. We can see that in verse 13. In the last part of verse 13, it references a man by the name of Antipas who lived there. He was a faithful witness who was martyred in Pergamum. Going on to verse 14, we start reading about some of the false teachers in this church of Pergamum. Some of them were following false teachers, such as Balaam and the Nicolaitans. And so if you take all of these different elements that I've mentioned, the false teachers, the false gods, such as Zeus that they worshipped, the many new ideas associated with their huge library, plus the fact that there was no more persecution. And what does this add up to? Compromise. The question I ask myself, do I compromise with the world? Have I become married to the world? In verse 17, we read, to the victor, and it mentions manna, a source of sustenance during the Exodus. And it reminds us that Jesus is the bread of life and that he will sustain us in the end times, both spiritually and physically. Also, it mentions a white stone. And this has many different interpretations, but the one that I like the most is where it was explained that they would write their name on this stone. They would break it in half, write their own name, each of them on one of the halves, and then they would exchange it. And so it was a symbol of friendship until they would meet again. And it reminds us that Jesus is our friend. The next church is Thyatira. Thyatira was the center of worship for Apollo, who was the son of Zeus. Both Apollo and Emperor Domitian were referred to as the sons of Zeus. So this is the only place in Revelation where Jesus is called, in verse 18, the Son of God, countering them being the sons of Zeus. Notice also in verse 18, he is the one whose eyes are like a fiery flame, a reference back in chapter 1, verse 14, to Jesus' eyes. And notice the feet of bronze. There was a bronze working industry in Thyatira, and Thyatira was a prosperous commercial center. After compliments of their works of love and so forth, Jesus then criticizes this church. Thyatira, we are told here, is the first church that tolerated or put up with false teachers, teachers that promoted sexual immorality and idolatry. The greatest pressures in the previous church, Pergamum, were religious, worshiping Zeus, for example. But here in Thyatira, there were also, in addition to the worship of Domitian and Zeus' son Apollo, there were also economic pressures from business interests. I have on a map here, that black line that you see is the division between Asia and Europe. Paul, in one of his missionary journeys, crossed over this line into Europe, and the first city he went to was Philippi. Who was Paul's first European conversion? It was in Philippi. And you remember that it was Lydia, a seller of purple cloth, and where was she from? Thyatira. We read that in the 16th chapter of Acts. There were numerous trade guilds, or what we might say unions, who centered their social activities around idol worship in Thyatira. People like Lydia could be under pressure to go to these meetings. They would eat meat sacrificed to idols, and there would be temple prostitutes there that they would involve themselves with. And to not join could mean financial loss. So this was serious to them. I have a friend, Sam, who laid carpet for a living. He showed up at one work site, and he started doing his tools and getting ready to install the carpet, and it was a union work site, and the union boss came up and asked him if he was a member of the union, and he said he was. And so he said, okay, I'll be back later for your paperwork. I have to go to another job site. And so Sam got busy laying his carpet, and when he was through, he left. He wanted to leave in a hurry because even though he hadn't lied, he wasn't really a member of the carpet layers union. He was a member of the credit union. And so for him to have, he could have been kicked off of that job site and lost money, lost that job because of the pressure put on him by the union. And so that type of activity was also going on at Thyatira 2,000 years ago. In verse 21, Jesus says, I gave her time to repent, but she refused, resulting in verse 22, great tribulation, unless they repent. This is the picture of a church going astray. And so the question I ask, faced with a difficult test, the loss of a job, or a serious illness, will I trust God to supply my needs? In verse 25 and 26, they are told to hold on to what you have, and you will rule over the nations. And you'll also have the morning star, Jesus himself, if you will just remain faithful, if you will endure. Well, that completes chapter 2. In the second half of this session, we'll begin with chapter 3 and the church at Sardis. I'll see you then.